I thought maybe to kind of warm us up, let's consider a few of these. We'll play a quick little game of who said that, all right? I'm going to put some quotes here on the screen. Let's see if you guys know who made these observations about life. So our first one, life is like a box of chocolates. See, I stumped you guys already. Mama said life is like a box of chocolates. It was Forrest Gump's mom, all right? Easier one, life is a highway. Rascal Flatts, come on, people. Tom Cochrane was the Canadian guy who said it first. All right, here's another one. Here's another song. Life is a Carnival. A little more obscure. You guys know that one? Life is a Carnival by the band. That was the band. All right, we're going to get a little trickier now, although you guys aren't doing so good so far. Life is like riding a bicycle. Very simple task. Who would have said something like that? It was actually Albert Einstein said life is like riding a bicycle. Life is one big road with lots of signs. Another famous singer on this one. That was Bob Marley who said that. Life is a complex matter. You'd think that would come from somebody like Einstein. That was actually Walt Disney said that one. Life is a fairy tale written by God's fingers. This one's neat because there's kind of a clue there. Famous writer of fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen said that one. Okay, one last one for you guys. Life is a wager. That was outspoken atheist and writer Christopher Hitchens. That's an interesting one, this last one. Christopher Hitchens said, all the time I felt that life is a wager and that I probably was getting more out of leading a bohemian existence as a writer than I would have if I didn't. And I say this is an interesting one because, again, he's outspoken atheist, and I think Christopher Hitchens kind of represents this growing worldview that life is just the result of an evolutionary process that came out of a big accident, a big cosmic accident, a big bang. You know, recent polls of just a couple of years ago, they polled in the United States and found that 51% of Americans under the age of 30 believe in purely secular evolution. That is, that there is no divine guidance or power that's involved in this. It's purely evolutionary. But this is kind of interesting because how many people actually live their lives and approach their lives firmly embracing that viewpoint? I mean, if we did that, we wouldn't go around saying things like, life is like a box of chocolates. We'd say, you know, life is a highly organized system of cells performing complex biological processes. That's the analogy we'd be using. But we don't see that. In fact, you know, Christopher Hitchens himself seems to be seeking some greater fulfillment, or at least enjoyment, out of life, even though he believes it's a simple accident. You know, if we believe that, shouldn't we be walking around just trying to survive? Wouldn't we just be trying to feed our metabolic processes, protect ourselves from outside threats, and reproducing? That's what life would be about. And where's the fun in that? That's not how we live. And you know, this was kind of driven home recently because I went to see Star Wars. I went to see the latest Star Wars. And you know, this thing has been out for a couple of weeks. And I'm at an afternoon matinee, and there's like 3 or 4 of these showings happening simultaneously, and the theater is packed with people. And I'm looking around thinking, you know, a lot of these people probably think that life is nothing more than the result of a cosmic accident. And yet here we are shelling out all this money to see these movies that centers around a force that binds all of life together and people fulfilling a destiny. Like this franchise has earned $37 billion over 40 years. It's huge. And so I want to talk about this morning, this outlook on life, that life as a destiny to be realized. Destiny, it's a neat concept. And actually, if you kind of investigate the word destiny, we actually get that from the French and Latin languages. Its roots have meanings of something that is made firm or something that is established. And we get our word destiny, or even destination is a related word. And that's very interesting. Because if we believe in a God who creates the heavens, the earth, and life itself, then we would believe in a God, likely, who has a plan, who establishes, who makes things firm, right? And so as a result, I think that's what feeds this deep desire within us to see destiny realized. That's why we love movies like Star Wars, where we've got these characters like Luke Skywalker and Rey, who come out of nothing to fulfill this great destiny. If you're not a Star Wars nerd, it's why we have romantic movies about 2 people from completely different classes or backgrounds who are united by fate. That's always the way it goes. And it's why we love rags to riches stories and stories about people who, come from nothing and overcome great odds to do amazing things. Destiny it's just rooted in so many of the great stories. And of course, it goes back in time to some of the most enduring stories we have, especially the Bible itself. And that's what we're going to be drawing from in this series, of course. But we're not just going to pick out tidy little verses and metaphors for life, little proverbs and things like that. We're actually going to look at people written about in the Bible whose lives actually lived out some of the things we're going to look at in this series. And so for today's purpose, we have lots of options to choose from. I mean, again, if we believe in God as a designer and a creator, one who knits purpose into his creations, then clearly pretty much all the lives in the Bible speak of destiny and of his purpose. But in my mind, one of the greatest kind of case studies for destiny is Moses. Moses is just like this epic hero in history, right? I mean, whether you're well-versed in the Bible or not, you probably know his story. You've probably seen Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. I grew up, my dad, playing that every Easter. Or you at least maybe watched the DreamWorks movie Prince of Egypt a few years ago if you've got kids. And you know the basics, right? That Moses, he's chosen by God to save his people from slavery in Egypt. God parts the Red Sea and he leads them through, and they spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness until Moses takes them to Mount Sinai, and he comes down with the big stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, gives them the law, right? It's a cool, very cool story. Now, we don't have time to go through that story in detail this morning, so I want to focus in on how Moses came to realize his destiny. So we're going to look at sort of an origin story, the beginnings of Moses. And since we're talking about his origin story and just how deeply these stories of destiny resonate with us, it might be worth pointing out that there's a lot of speculation that the story of Moses' birth was actually inspired the story of Superman. This is very cool. Think about it. This child who's destined for great things, saved by his parents from imminent death, put in a vessel and cast adrift to be found and adopted by other parents in a strange new place, and rises up to do great things. It's a neat theory. And actually, creators Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster, they actually deny this, but they are also known for having tried to conceal their Jewish heritage in order to make it in the business in the 30s, because there was a lot of discrimination. So who knows? But just an interesting little side note. So what I want to do this morning is I want to read through the first few chapters of Exodus, which tells Moses' story. And it's an amazing story, and we can read it this morning. I think we can be in awe of what it tells us about Moses. But I'm going to point some things out along the way as well, some things that realizing our destiny might require from us as well. And so just to preface this before we begin, we need to know that Moses' birth came at a very dark hour. The Hebrew people were growing and actually flourishing for a time in Egypt until Pharaoh forced them into slave labor, and he was worried about their growth, so he actually ordered every male Hebrew baby to be thrown into the Nile and drowned. But throughout Israel's history, we see this again and again, God raising up leaders through some special or miraculous birth, his provision and protection for them. At the beginning of their lives, it always kind of indicates that this person is going to go on to do something great, that his destiny is divinely ordained, and we'll see that in Exodus 2. You can follow along. It's quite a bit of reading, so if you've got a device or a Bible with you, you can follow, put just the verse numbers on the screen so you know where we are. So Exodus 2 starts like this. About this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance watching to see what would happen to him. Soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, "I lifted him out of the water." So destiny, as you can probably see, is written all over this story. The mother, right away recognizes this baby is special in some way, and so she tries to hide him. But ultimately, she's desperate. She can't hide him anymore, so she sets him adrift on the Nile in this little basket. So now just think of all the ways God must have protected that baby. It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. You know, the current of the river had to be just right to carry him but not overturn this basket. It had to deposit him at just the right spot. The reed basket that she made had to survive that journey somehow. There didn't seem to be any predators about, which certainly in the Nile there would be crocodiles and things of that nature. The timing of the princess to come down at that moment to bathe, and then to actually just look in that direction and to spot this little reed basket nestled somewhere in the riverbank. The impulse of the sister to step forward and say, hey, do you want me to find someone to nurse him? And then this just very bizarre resolve in the princess's heart to say, yes, I'm going to take this Hebrew baby as my own. It makes me think, have you ever looked back at the events of your life and kind of counted up the number of little details that maybe seemed trivial at the time that added up to a really momentous turning point in your life? Have you considered those what ifs? You know, what if that didn't happen and that didn't happen? I wouldn't be where I am today. So isn't it interesting how this took place, the number of things that happened, and then that God would place Moses right into the hands of the royal family that he was going to grow up to overturn. You know, God had already had already purposed Moses to free Israel from Egyptian oppression, but then he goes to and positions him perfectly to be in this place where he could spend his entire childhood, his entire youth, and much of his adult life learning firsthand Egypt's laws, systems, government, idolatry, even the family that ruled it, right? He knew everything that went on behind the scenes. Pretty amazing. And this play that God made, you could look at it and say, well, it's on one hand brilliant, but also seems risky. And that speaks to just how powerful this destiny God had for Moses was. Because the reason I say this is because if you think about it, Moses is raised from infanthood in Egyptian culture. So Moses would identify as an Egyptian. I would presume that being part of Pharaoh's family would come with a lot of wealth and privilege. And we suspect that Moses probably held some sort of powerful rank as he grew up. Josephus, who was a first-century Jewish scholar, he actually said that Moses was an Egyptian general who actually defeated the Ethiopians, and we don't know for certain, but think of all these things that must have been going on. So why would Moses ever decide to give all that up? What would cause him to give up the only life he'd ever known as an Egyptian man and instead choose to identify with this slave people group that were working for them? Why would he give up his adopted parents for a bunch of Hebrew slaves? And the only answer I can see is this idea of destiny. Some sense of call on his life that somehow he became inclined to at some point. Something caused him to take notice of the Hebrew oppression, and he was compelled to do something about it. And that's what we're going to read next. Verse 11 in chapter 2 picks this up. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everyone knows what I did." And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. So here we see some sort of powerful change has taken place. Can you just imagine the courage, the faith, the conviction that must have just exploded in Moses for him to step forward and act the way he did? For this privileged prince to stick his neck out for a bunch of filthy slaves, worthless to him, to jeopardize his status. Even more than that, to rebel against whom he would have considered his own family at that point, to reject his adoptive parents, his father's mother, and to stir up the anger of his father. Keep in mind, this guy is known for killing babies, right? This was courage and selflessness on a heroic scale. You can kind of see how Moses could have inspired something as huge as Superman, right? So we have to ask then, well, what went wrong? He did this, but the plan seemed to backfire. Where was the God who had protected that little baby floating down the Nile River when he's finally trying to fulfill his destiny? And I think the problem is this. One thing we need to know about destiny is it's not of our own design. Destiny, as we said, the roots of that word are that which has already been established. So it wasn't established by us. It was established before us. It was established by God. Moses had no authority at that point to act in the way he did. He just took it upon himself. And notice the question he was faced with by the second group of Hebrews he was trying to help. He was trying to help this man who was getting beaten up. He said, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge?" The Hebrew man said to Moses. And that question, we read that and go, wow, that's pretty ungrateful. But I'm sure that probably stabbed right into the heart of Moses because he knew the answer, who appointed him to do that. It was nobody. Nobody had appointed him at that point. He had no authority or responsibility for the Hebrew people. There was nothing he could do himself that was going to earn their respect or their trust. Moses must have developed some kind of zeal for his destiny to have done this, but it was still being worked out in God's ways, in God's timing, and he wasn't seeing that happen. So he was forced to flee. He had risked everything, and he lost everything. And he ends up in a desert region called Midian. And I want to think about the frame of mind he must have had at that point. He probably didn't have much feeling or faith in a destiny at that point. You know, he had tried to take up his mantle as hero and savior, and in return he lost his home, his family, his security, everything. And he probably felt like he lost his God, that he was abandoned. So here's something I think we can discern from this story about destiny, is that sometimes destiny is about letting go. You know, art and literature and these stories we've talked about, they've created some very romantic notions for us about destiny. It's like this glamorous idea of becoming something greater than ourselves, about achieving this unfulfilled potential in us that's just waiting there for us. And to an extent, it is those things. But I think sometimes we confuse destiny with our dreams. We think destiny can be some sort of goal we can create for ourselves and go out and achieve it, and it's all in our control. But remember, destiny is something already established. And if that's true, then in order to achieve it, then we may need to let go of some things that we've dreamed up in its place, that we've invented along the way. Maybe we need to leave behind what we think we already know. And I think this is the experience that Moses was going through as he headed off into Midian. He probably felt alone and hopeless, probably faithless, like a failure for sure, defeated. Clearly he's frightened for his life and his survival. He's running. He's on the run. But God was still there. His destiny was still firmly established. It was there before him. And God reminded him of this, because let's see what happens next. In verse 15, it says, "When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherds. Then he drew water for their flocks." So here's Moses, this guy in the depths of disappointment, afraid for his life, complete and utter despair. And God reminds him, "Moses, you do have a destiny." Moses had been completely humbled, brought to his lowest point, but he was called upon in that moment to rescue someone who was probably in an even lower position. Because in both Hebrew and Egyptian culture, women had lower status than men. And especially in Egyptian culture, shepherds didn't rank very high either. But here they are, and in spite of all of his past, Moses finds it in himself to stand up for these people, a bunch of shepherd girls in the middle of the desert. And this was shocking enough, I think, that Moses would have stepped up and stood up for them. But to further humble himself, this Egyptian prince, and take the posture of their servant by watering their flock afterward. Like, that would have been disgraceful as an Egyptian elite to water sheep for a bunch of shepherd girls. You know, later in the story, it says the daughters went to their father and told them about this, and there's emphasis in the text that he actually drew water for us. All of his past, his experience, his preconceptions, his ideas of what his destiny would be, they're all being stripped away. God was stripping these things away. And he was learning that he didn't just need purpose, but he needed humility in this as well. He needed to let go of all of his own self-made authority so that he would be open and ready to receive God's authority. And I think that's the lesson Moses is learning as we move kind of into Act 2 of his origin story here going forward. At this point, Moses kind of settles in. He marries one of these shepherd girls, and he settles into a very pastoral life of humble work, working the soil, working with the sheep. It's a world away from the Egyptian palace that he once lived in, and with this kind of grand sense of destiny that was building in his mind. I doubt that at this point he's entertaining any ideas of some grand destiny. Instead, he's kind of resigned himself to a life of obscurity. And so chapter 3, a bit of reading here, starts like this. It says, "One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush." Now this bushfires would have been a common thing, but they would have gone up in smoke and flame and disappeared. But Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. "This is amazing," Moses said to himself. "Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go and see it." When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the burning bush, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," Moses replied. "Do not come any closer," the Lord warned. "Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord told him, "I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I'm aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have now seen how harshly the Egyptians abused them. Now go, for I'm sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt." But Moses protested to God, Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt?" God answered, "I will be with you, and this is your sign that I am the one who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain." Now remember back when Moses killed the Egyptian, what the Bible text was telling us was that Moses had taken notice of the Hebrew oppression. But here we get a little flip on this because it says God now has taken notice. Moses didn't have the authority to act back then, but God is giving it to him now, saying, "I am sending you." So it's finally time for Moses to realize his identity and his destiny, but the irony is, Moses doesn't want it now. You know, in Egypt, he was this mighty figure of Egyptian royalty. He was the son of the Pharaoh. Maybe he was a victorious general or some high-ranking official, and he had made up his mind at that point to save his people. But now he says, "Who am I to appear before Pharaoh, my own adopted father? Who am I to lead this people out of Israel?" And he was once, remember too, asked by that Hebrew man, "Who made you prince and judge?" And now he says, "Who am I? Who am I? I'm nothing." And he protests further. This goes on for a bit beyond the text we just read. He says, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God says, "Tell them it was the God of your fathers and your ancestors. I am that I am." And then Moses says, "Well, what if they don't listen to me?" And God gives him 3 miraculous signs. He says, "You'll take this staff and turn it into a snake. You'll put your hand in your cloak and pull it out, and it will be leprous, and you put it back in, and it will be healed. And you'll turn the Nile to blood." But none of these things overcome Moses' anxiety. Because here in verse 10, he keeps going. He keeps protesting. He says, Moses pleaded with the Lord, "Oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been, and I'm not now, even though you have spoken to me. I get tongue-tied, and my words get tangled." Then the Lord asked Moses, "Who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say." But Moses again pleaded, "Lord, please send anybody else." So at this point, Moses had let go. He had let go of everything he thought he knew. He'd given up all his privilege as son of Pharaoh and all the advantages that came with that. And the world would probably ask him, for what? What did you give this all up for, to become a shepherd in the desert? Life had taken a very bad turn if you look at where he is right now. But if he had stayed in that Egyptian palace, he never would have had a personal encounter with God beside a burning bush in the desert. He never would have understood that the responsibility for his destiny was not his own, but that it was God's. Although clearly Moses wasn't seeing it this way at first. He reveals the truth in how he was feeling by the way he's protesting and saying, Lord, please send anybody else but me. At this point, he simply does not want to obey God. He's learned this difficult lesson that destiny sometimes requires us to let something go and leave things behind, but maybe he's learned that a little too well because it seems like he's totally given up. So here's the counterpoint, is that sometimes destiny is about holding on. Sometimes it's about trusting in what has already been established by God. He said, I'm not good at speaking. God said, well, who creates the mouth and establishes the words? Sometimes it's having faith that God has created a good plan and purpose for our lives and finding security in that. It's holding on to that hope that's going to see us through those quiet years or periods or times or whatever that looks like for you when you're not hearing from God, where you feel like he's absent and you're kind of sent adrift like Moses had been. It's knowing that we're not alone, that our lives are not the product of some cosmic accident, but the creation of an intelligent and loving designer. Destiny is letting go of everything that is only us. It's only about us and for us and from us, but it's also holding on to everything that is from God, who establishes it all. God said, I'll send you. He told Moses, I will send you. You don't need to worry about this stuff. I will be with you. Destiny is God's work. It's his work, not ours, and we're just invited into it. And I think this is all part of the mysterious way that God works. He brought the universe into existence just by speaking it, by commanding it to exist. So, he could do the same thing for anything else, to free his people from Egypt. He could just say it and it would happen. But instead, he chose to work through this disgraced prince, this lonely man who's just full of disappointment. I don't know how bitter Moses was at this point. He was a failure. Why would God do that? Why would he choose to use this guy who failed once before, was past his prime, seemed hopeless? All throughout the Bible, we see that God speaks to people. And he works on their behalf, and he works through them and uses them. And I think that's what God looks at and means by destiny and these things that are established. Of course, God went on to use Moses in great ways, and we talked about that at the beginning. He ultimately fulfilled his destiny. He led the people out of Egypt. He led them through the Red Sea that God parted, into the desert and on Mount Sinai. And it wasn't without its ups and downs. There's still lots of stuff happening along the way, but God was with him along the way. God did these things. Moses was just a part of it. God brought the plagues on Egypt. God parted the sea. God gave the Israelites food in the wilderness. God met with Moses on the mountain and gave him the law. Moses was involved in all that, but it was God's work. And I think this moment that we just read about when God met Moses in the burning bush, and Moses responded, and there was this exchange, it transformed who Moses was. And I think that's a better picture maybe of his destiny than all the stuff that happened after. I feel like, we often think of destiny as this perfected version of ourselves that we're moving towards, that we're going to arrive someday. And there's this unfulfilled potential that's just going to lead up to some great outcome for us. And it is those things, again, it is to an extent, but I think the story of Moses shows us it's more than that destiny is not so linear. It's not a straight path from what we are to becoming what we're meant to be or doing what we're meant to do. So I think of a well-known image of transformation, of destiny, so to speak, is a butterfly. And I've read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to my kids numerous times. The little caterpillar, he eats and eats, and he grows and grows. And he moves towards this destiny where he becomes a beautiful butterfly. Pretty clear. But do you know what actually takes place for a butterfly to happen? Inside the cocoon, the caterpillar actually digests itself. It secretes enzymes that break down and dissolves all of its tissues into a goo. But there are certain highly organized groups of cells that are called imaginal discs, and they survive that digestive process, and then they undergo rapid transformation and cell division to form the body parts that would become the butterfly. There are some caterpillar muscles and sections of the nervous system that are actually preserved and do become part of the final butterfly. And there are even studies that show some moths remember what they learned in the later stages of their lives as caterpillars as they move to become a butterfly. And so this is an interesting image of transformation because I think it's kind of a neat metaphor for what happened with Moses. and maybe what happens with us. We have a destiny with God, and it's beautiful, right? And it's certain that we're going to realize it, but it's a process of transformation, and that can get a little bit messy. Destiny is something established. The end result of a butterfly is established. It's made firm. But we don't necessarily see what that outcome is going to look like, because it's not something we defined or created for ourselves. God made it. He sees it. It's His work that serves His purposes, and He brings it about in us and through us and with us. Maybe along the way we get our own ideas, we get distracted, we find other outcomes that look tempting and look good. And so destiny is kind of fraught with turmoil, so God needs to strip all this stuff away and get us back to our foundation, to those imaginal discs, so to speak, that are going to form the part of us that comes out of this. The parts of us that are made in His image, that are sensitive to Him and His plans, that's what needs to survive, and everything else can be stripped away. There's a great quote sort of about this, and kind of a bit of a practical viewpoint, I think, on this and how to think about it. In the devotional commentary on Exodus by F.B. Meyer, he says, "Cherish the lowliest thought you choose of yourself, but unite it with the loftiest conception of God's all-sufficiency. We must think soberly of ourselves, not too lowly, but not too extravagantly." There's a balance. Our destinies, he's saying, are made of our humanness united with God's sufficiency. Now, your destinies, my destinies, they might not be on the same scale and scope as Moses. Clearly, he served a very unique purpose in history, and so we got to be careful not to superimpose his life onto ours. But I think we can learn some things from his story too. You know, this world we live in of cosmic accidents and survival of the fittest, it would tell us that we have no destiny. There is no great purpose, no inherent value. It's just what we can make of it. And the world told Moses the same. He was born as a worthless Hebrew baby destined to be thrown in the Nile River. But God redeemed him. He made him a prince. Later, he became a hero and a savior and went down in history. But more importantly, I think the important part is that he was a man who knew God personally and who lived with him by faith and followed him and sought that. And it's lucky for us we have this story that Moses kind of figured it out. You know, again, there were bumps along the way, but destiny, I think, is not any single outcome or even accumulation of achievements that we can earn. It's more clearly seen in those encounters that we have with God. In those moments, I think our destiny is realized in the transformation that takes place in us as we work out this relationship and this communion with God. And that's what Moses was doing in this contact at the burning bush, where they had that exchange and something came out of that.